Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to talk today about liberty. What is true Christian liberty? What is liberty, freedom, in the understanding of the Catholic Church? And instead of going through a ton of different citations and screen shares of statements from popes, I've sort of been reading about this a lot over the last few years, and I thought I would just share sort of the meta-analysis of what we even mean by being free, the different conceptions of that, and how this is, generally speaking, understood in the Christian tradition. Now, before we continue, there is debate about the limits of how one ought to be free or tolerated and so forth, depending on various political circumstances, but the principles themselves remain. People can debate whether or not they should advocate this particular political philosophy or not. As far as I can tell, there are certain aspects of various political philosophies that, in a sense, have been condemned by the church, insofar as, anarchism in the strict sense or whatever is not really compatible with Catholicism. Of course, socialism, communism, because of its collectivist atmosphere. But kind of within the boundaries of what is possible or could be accepted by Catholic teaching, there is room for debate. So I'm not here to get into whether or not one should be more of an integralist or more of a libertarian-minded fellow or more of an Edmund Burkean conservative or more of a monarchist or whatever. These things are left for debate, and I'm not going to do that here. Before we continue, I would like to thank our sponsor, Queen of Victory Rosaries. You can see this beautiful rosary I have right here. This is wonderful because these rosaries are very durable, but they still have that elegance of something like more of a nicer, fancier rosary, which is nice too because, it's got the durability of something like a combat rosary, but you can still put it in your pocket and it's not going to be too cumbersome. You can check out their information at the Etsy store, Queen of Victory Rosaries. You can find that on Etsy. And you can see here the various types they have. They're beautiful. They range in prices. I mean, they have everything from, these sort of, Catholic themed tea diffusers and things like that, all the way to, single decade rosaries and whatnot. You can find these things in the link to the description of this video. Why can't I figure out my screen share thing there? And you can also have custom-made rosaries if you just email her or contact her through the Etsy store. If anything breaks down because of general wear and tear, she'll fix that as well. So thank you to Queen of Victory Rosaries for sponsoring this video. Okay, what is liberty? Well, the word liberty is pretty much a synonym for the word freedom. Now, there's generally speaking two conceptions that have sort of bandied back and forth throughout human history. And I'm generalizing here, but for the sake of conversation, we should keep it brief. On the one hand, you essentially have the freedom to do whatever you want without constraint. This is what we would understand by the sort of modern understanding of freedom. So when somebody says, I have the freedom to do X, Y, and Z, usually what they're referring to is this idea that they basically can do whatever they want. On the other hand, you have this more traditional understanding of, let's say, a liberty for righteousness or a liberty attached to duties. What does this mean? Well, you have the freedom or the liberty to do X, Y, and Z because you must do X, Y, and Z. You have a duty to do X, Y, and Z. So, for example, during the lockdowns, people would say, well, this is wrong. I have the right to work. And it's true. You do have a right to work in the sense that, in the sense that you have a duty to provide for your family, let's say. You have a right to work insofar as you have a duty to honor your contract. I mean, these are rights that are attached to duties. This is more of the traditional Catholic perspective that has been understood, especially by Pope Leo XIII, for example. But in our day, this idea that you have freedom is really more often than not understood as a type of licentiousness. So if we use an example, okay, you have the license to drive, but you don't have the freedom to drive into my house. You have a license to, you have the license, meaning you have the ability, or you're free from constraint or coercion, that you can, play sports in the park. But you don't have the right to set up camp and make your house in the park. This is where you understand this difference between having the sort of license to do something and the actual right as far as a real liberty is concerned in order to do other things. The most difficult issue of liberty comes down to the issue of religious freedom. This is something that has plagued the conversation in the church, especially since the Second Vatican Council. It was bubbling up during the 1800s and so forth, and you can find these notions of religious liberty condemned. But this is a very difficult conversation to have with people because, especially in the sort of Anglo-Saxon world, whether it be Canada or the United States or even in England, these countries, although Canada does have a massive Catholic influence, of course, with the French history, but this idea that you have religious liberty is seen as something sacrosanct. So we should probably unpack this idea a little bit if we can. So if we were to go back to this idea of religious liberty as understood, and again, I'm just doing the sort of 30,000-foot view here. If we do go back to the idea of religious liberty, generally speaking, as understood by the founders of the United States of America, you have to understand the intention and the context in which they're talking about this. Really, what the founders are referring to is basically you have the right to be some sort of Christian or not. There's this deism, this sort of, generally speaking, liberal, Freemason-inspired idea of the God as the grand architect and the creator, and we all sort of have this God, and we appeal to him for the basis of reality and for some certain philosophical principles. But there's no revealed church. There's no monopoly on which scriptures are true, which ones aren't. You see this very much in the American tradition, which is why you have the religions of Unitarianism and Jehovah's Witness and Mormonism and things like that really bubble up in the United States, because there's this understanding that God is real, but there's this understanding, which is sort of a Protestant understanding when it's flowered completely, that no one really can say that the scriptures must say this, they must say that. There's really no idea. There's really no way you can have some sort of real church, so to speak. It's kind of left up for opinion. In fairness, though, to the founders of the United States, really what they were referring to was something more like a religious tolerance. So the customs that had been received by the people of the sort of English and Anglo-Saxon spheres and Western European spheres that emigrated to the United States, these peoples came from Christian societies, and they had their various types of churches. Many of the people who were going to the United States, of course, were leaving England and other places, especially the Puritans and things like that, because of something like religious persecution. Now, that story has been lionized to make it seem like these were martyrs. Well, these were heretics. As a Catholic, I would understand these are heretics fleeing from the persecution of other heretics. So it's not really, a story of look at those good guys and the bad guys. It's the result of Protestantism, and you have this confusion. But nonetheless, the ethos was essentially, here's this new land. There's a massive amount of space. There's a massive amount of opportunity. We are looking for a new place to have a different way of life because of the fact that we can't really do this where we're from. So let's kind of have our places, and we'll sort of leave each other alone as best as possible. And if you look at the different colonies at the beginning of the United States, they did have state churches. I think it was it 8 of the 13 colonies? They had state churches. It was not this idea that, anything goes religiously. Really, it was understood, this idea of religious liberty, that the communities of people basically had the right to be the religion that they wanted to be. Again, religion being Christianity or non-Christianity, not being a churchgoer. But it wasn't the same as, here in Canada or United States today. You have Christianity, you have Islam, you have Hinduism, you have the various resurgences of paganism, you have Buddhism, you have Sikhs. It was not, you have Jews. It was nothing like that. It was nothing like that at all. And anyone who's telling you that they meant what is happening today with this unadulterated religious licentiousness, they're being dishonest, because that's just clearly not what happened. Nonetheless, it was more of a religious tolerance of Christian-ish beliefs. That being said, there definitely was a prejudice towards Catholicism, which you can find if you look. It's not hard to find. So that's sort of the understanding of liberty that we've inherited through this tradition of religious liberty. And this has, again, I'm trying to be as fair as possible because the founders of the United States, they weren't like complete relativists when it came to morals necessarily. So I don't want to give a stereotype or a caricature, but this religious liberty really was something like a confused tolerance. And then as things have progressed, you've seen sort of the downfall of the religious conscience in the West, so to speak, and now because of the various philosophies, especially Hegel and Descartes, and, well, more Kant than Descartes, but because of these sort of modern philosophies, we have basically a confusion of truth itself, reality itself, and as a result, religious liberty has become such a farce of a term because it pretty much means to everybody now, you have the right to be free of any dogma whatsoever. You have religious liberty, meaning you have liberty from religion. And that's kind of what people believe today. You saw this especially during lockdowns when the churches were closed, and you would say, like, what happened to my right of freedom of religion? Trying to appeal to these beliefs that people are supposed to hold. I mean, again, I think they're erroneous, but nonetheless, if it's there for your benefit and it's something in the legal system, you can try to use it to your advantage. And people would say, God doesn't care if there is a God, doesn't care if you pray in your bathroom or if you pray in the church. Your freedom of religion doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want. It just means you get to believe things. This is what it's become for people. Religion is just something that you believe, and therefore you have the freedom of religion because you get to believe in religions. That's pretty much what people think nowadays. I would say, again, I don't think this is what the founders of the United States would have envisioned, but nonetheless, this is sort of the logical consequence to something that's at least a tacit relativism. Now, the Christian perspective, the Catholic perspective on liberty is more concrete. Liberty must be attached to a duty. So there is only one religion that has freedom in the sense of it actually has rights. And this is Catholicism. And why? Because there is a duty attached to Catholicism. God ought to be worshipped. He must be worshipped. Therefore, we have a duty to worship him. Therefore, we have the freedom to be Catholics. And not only do we have to worship God, he has to be worshipped rightly. You can understand this just by the natural law. We understand, I'll do this very quickly, but we understand that there must be a sacrificial religion that satisfies the effects of sin, because giving what is due is justice. So if you steal from somebody $100, you must sacrifice 100 of your own dollars and give them back. Then you must also give restitution. You must also give like a little extra to sort of repair the breach. This has to play into religion as well. If we make an affront and we take from God what he is due, meaning morality, obedience, righteous deeds, acknowledgement, whatever, if we take that away, then we have to give that back. But the problem is that we can't repair an existential breach because we're not divine. Therefore, God in some way must become man while still retaining his divinity so that a sacrifice that is somehow human and divine can be offered. You see, this is where you get to the reality of the crucifixion, just by using sort of the fundamental notion of theology, the fundamental notion of the theological principles of God, sin, sacrifice, reparation, and so forth. And then the problem is after the crucifixion, we still sin. So any action of God, so to speak, is perfect or complete in a sense, and therefore this crucifixion is once and for all. But we still sin, so God humbles himself in a certain way where, in conjunction with God, we can offer the worthy sacrifice that is Christ substantially present in the Holy Eucharist. Okay, you see how this kind of becomes this is how we can argue for Catholicism based on the basic tenets of sort of natural law philosophy. Okay, so this sacrifice must continue. Okay? And because we understand that there must be sacrifice in the life of a Christian in order for that Christian to be ordered towards the good and to obey God, he has a duty to obey God, then we have to understand that the society as such must have this duty as well, because the society is a collection of individual persons and families. Okay? And on the one hand, we do have an individual reality. We are separated and different from other people, but at the same time, we're not atomistic. It's not an atomistic individuality where we're separated in a total sense. We are dependent on one another in sort of a human ecosystem. So we do have sort of our freedoms to be individuals, but at the same time, our actions cannot help but have effects on others, and therefore they must be governed in some fashion, whether it be by whatever means is decided upon as being the best. So the state must legislate the religion in some way, because if the state does not legislate the religion in some way, then the state is not affording the people what they're due, which is the true religion as the thing that has the rights in the society based on its necessity to serve God in the correct fashion that He has revealed to us. Okay, and again, this can take different formulations. There'll be debates between the different ways which monarchy should be done, the different sizes of kingdoms, the different ways in which a government should be governing this or that. That's not what I'm debating here. But the fact that it ought to be legislated in some way is apparent. Now, because of this, the state has a duty in some way, to suppress other religions. Now, people are going to get upset with this because they think, the church has never advocated for forced conversions. No, we're not talking about forced conversions. A forced conversion is impossible because there's no will attached to it. There's no intention. But what I mean by suppression, it can be active or it can be passive. It can be explicit or implicit. So, for example, a state, again, this depends much on the populace. It depends much on the presence of Catholics in the state. It depends on it depends on the precariousness of the social order in the prudential judgment of the legislators. But for example, it's funny, here in Ontario, we have a terrible government in many ways. We do have a state-approved religion when it comes to schools. We do have Catholicism as an approved, publicly funded school system. Now, the school system is a disaster. I worked in it. It's a communist Marxist hellhole when it comes to its morals and theology. But nonetheless, this is historically a kind of a good thing. Starting many decades ago, Catholic school was essentially free in Ontario for elementary school students. And then I think the first year or two were free in high school and you had to pay for the rest. Okay. This was a very, very good thing. Ontario was a very Catholic province. Obviously, after the Second Vatican Council, everything got screwed up because that's what happened after the council. It wasn't perfect beforehand, but I'm just speaking broadly here. So this Catholic system in Ontario, in a sense, was actually a good thing as far as an acknowledgement by the state that the state will put her funds into the promulgation of one religion explicitly. That is something like a modern example of a state acknowledging the truth of one religion as being one that has civil rights, if you want to put it that way, or state rights, or rights in the social sphere that others don't really have. Now, the other types of schools in Ontario were tolerated. There were Protestant schools and things like that. But they didn't receive, they were tolerated insofar as they were allowed to exist if the people wanted to do them, but they weren't facilitated by the state in a positive sense. So there's something where even in a very minor way, we actually see in the modern era, it's not just a thing for monarchies and Holy Roman Empire and things like that. In a country like Canada, which is not a state, is not officially a Catholic country, even here you see a province that historically has had something like an acknowledgement by the legislation that Catholicism had rights that other religions didn't have. It's very fascinating to think about it that way. Okay, and this is a correct thing to do. Obviously, again, the system has become a disaster because the church and her institution has become a disaster. So this is reflected in the civil sphere and whatever. I could tell you stories about the amount of heresy that I tried to fight within the system and how I was literally ignored by even the churchmen, especially the religion coordinators. They were the worst of the heretics. But nonetheless, this system historically demonstrates something like that. Okay, so. And to sort of close off here, the Christian concept of liberty is different than the modern concept of liberty, although there are parts of the modern concept of liberty that are definitely true. But often what you have is basically the vocabulary has a different definition. It's the same vocabulary, different dictionary. So people are appealing to something like liberty, and what they really mean is something that was historically understood as tolerance, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's my rant. I just was thinking about this, and I thought I'd hop on and do something quickly about it. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.